morning, students. So today is the fourth presentation for LSK3701 Life Skills Science and Technology Teaching in the Foundation Phase. I am your lecturer, Mrs. A. Carrim, and you can email me on ecarrier1@unisa.ac.za. So we're looking at Learning Unit 3 today, which is Planning for Science Teaching and Assessment. On completion of this learning unit, you should be able to do analyze and compare the different teaching approaches such as inquiry, integration of mathematics, language, and creativity, as well as the cultural historical perspective. You need to be able to identify suitable context for the application of these approaches, as well as suggest ways in which these approaches can be used successfully in the foundation phase classroom. You need to also use examples to cite, the use of approaches appropriate to the learning context, as well as compile reports in which you demonstrate the ability to design your own practice based on known teaching theories. You can also develop theme plans according to your interpretation of learning theories and demonstrate an understanding of the integration of science and technology through theme planning. Apply your understanding of the assessment or science learning in the foundation phase as well. Okay, so the aim of this learning unit is basically to introduce you to a few approaches to teaching science to young learners. You will be expected to analyze the different teaching approaches for their suitability to teach for scientific literacy. While you will be introduced to several teaching approaches, you will only be shown how to plan for teaching and learning based on inquiry. So the theoretical aspects of the first two learning units underpin, how-to of planning science activities and assessing learners to determine their knowledge and understanding of science content. I'm sure you remember the science process skills and the understanding of the nature of science. So now we're looking at the focus of assessment in teaching of science, which is process skills, conceptual understanding, and understanding of the nature of science. So I'm sure you can notice how these sections followed from learning unit 1 and 2. So we're looking at learners' development of process skills, learners' understanding of scientific concepts, and learners' understanding of the nature of science. So when developing learning using the curriculum as a starting point, it's very important that you read through the section, in terms of what are the two curricula that focus on how science must be taught and what must be taught. So the two curricula that focus on science that must be taught and what must be taught are the NCS, the Natural Sciences, which was in South Africa in 2002, and the CAPS document, which is a Life Skills for Foundation phase, also South Africa in 2011. Please refer to these documents. It's very important that you read through them and have a basic understanding. It's also very important for you to understand it when basically in the teaching practice component of this module and your career as well. So I will try to upload these documents on the additional resources if possible, so that it's easier to access these documents for some of you who struggle to download it. Okay, so you need to also refer to section 2.1 for a short description of the two documents. In this unit, we also focus on how the NCS, the Natural Sciences document. This is why you need to understand what documents are important in the teaching component of this subject area. So it describes the learning activities applicable to scientific investigations. So this document also refers to the learning activities as assessment standards in the first and only learning outcome for the foundation phase. So after you have studied these assessment standards, you should be able to describe how they compare with the stages of inquiry-based learning. And when you look at, according to the CAPS curriculum, you need to understand the best way to teach grade R learners about a topic of, for instance, dissolving substances in water. And what should learners in grade R do? So remember, according to the grade R CAPS curriculum, learners have to learn about the topic of dissolving substances in water. So in a teacher-centered lesson, a teacher might demonstrate, how different substances such as sugar and salt dissolve in water, and also how sand does not dissolve in water. Instead, it sinks to the bottom of the beaker, and how oil does not dissolve in water but floats on the top of the liquid as liquid. So, however, the CAPS curriculum requires teachers to teach inquiry process skills These skills cannot be taught in teacher-centered lessons. It requires learners to be involved in lessons. So the assessment standards in the NCS, the Natural Sciences, describe at what level learners in each grade should be able to perform a scientific investigation. So it's very important in respect of, for example, the water in solutions. Learners in grade R should be able to also contribute towards planning an investigation when a teacher asks the class if they think substances, such as sugar, salt, sand, or oil dissolve in water. So try to encourage your students or involve them in the process and give them the opportunity to tell the teacher what they know about substances that dissolve and don't dissolve in water. And also give them that opportunity to ask questions about what will be done and what are they, let them ask what they're curious about. Remember the wonder wall that we described in Learning Unit 2. So be allowed to carry out the investigation, basically allow them to carry out the investigation themselves, possibly in groups, by following simple instructions on how to mix the different substances with water. This actually creates a lot of excitement in the classroom and a lot of interest in learning. So be allowed to explain what is being done by using a few of the science words in the topic. For example, dissolve, keeping in mind that the scientific understanding only develops if a word is known. So refer to the discussion of bootstrapping in Learning Unit 1. So you can see how each learning unit filters through to the other and how a good understanding of each learning unit will help you in each one that follows. So when you're looking at the approaches to teaching science to young learners, in this section, you will see a description of a few approaches to teaching science to young learners, and particularly with respect to young learners' development, of process skills, conceptual change in young learners, and young learners' ideas about the nature of science. So it is recommended that you revise, the discussion on the nature of science in Learning Unit 1 and the descriptions of the process skills that help to develop learners' understanding of the nature of science in Learning Unit 2. I can't stress the importance of this. Our main focus will basically be on how to plan a theme based on inquiry. So also thinking about the cultural historical perspective and the integrated approach will also be discussed afterwards. So when developing a theme based on inquiry, you need to understand what does IBSE stand for. I know at some stages you'll notice this, but just remember it's inquiry based science education, and it's regarded as an inspiring way, of teaching science because it focuses on learners' interest and also stimulates active learning by enabling learners to conduct their own investigation. So the IBSE allows learners, it basically gives a positive influence on learners and on learners' motivation to basically learn science. And IBSE also allows learners to develop an understanding of scientific concepts, inquiry process skills, and the nature of science. So an open IBSE specifically allows learners to conduct, self-designed interest-guided inquiry to answer their own questions. And in open IBSE, teachers fulfill the role of facilitators, supporting and supervising their learners during learning activities. So now we're looking at the 4 domains of scientific understanding that should be addressed during open IBSE, and conceptual, the NOS, the social and procedural domains. So when it comes to conceptual domains, learners need conceptual knowledge, regarding the topic under investigation in order to perform the inquiry to processes. And when we look at the nature of science domain, this is when learners need to think, think about the scientific knowledge, what scientific knowledge is and how it is developed by scientists. And then when you come to the social domain, we need to give learners, an opportunity to talk in their groups about their understanding of the topic being investigated. And when you look at the procedural domain, though, that's when the learners need to develop the process skills, during an inquiry, as well as the skill of using the scientific knowledge. So the 4 domains basically reflect aspects of science that should be addressed, when the phases of inquiry-based science learning are planned. And there are different ways of planning the phases of an inquiry-based cycle of learning. So you may come across a 5-phase cycle, but we will focus on the 7-phase cycle as described by Banum and then Berov and Peters. So we'll refer to that in the presentation as well. You need to also consider, the linkages between the 7 phases. But before we do that, I need to stress the importance of going through table 3.2, basically giving you a good indication of what the introduction requires: exploration, designing an investigation, conducting an investigation, conclusion, presentation and communication, deepening and broadening. You will see the template in the later section in the presentation, where most of the questions require you to incorporate the 7 phase inquiry based learning cycle within your lesson plan. It's because to ensure that the go if you look at the introduction, we will discuss the linkages between the 7 phase based cycle and the assessment standards of the South African curriculum using a diagram. So it appears that elements of this of 6 of the 7 phases of the inquiry-based cycle are described in the South African curriculum, and even so, there are details missing, which would allow for the development of the 4 domains, that we just went through now, of scientific understanding. So, if the 4 domains of scientific understanding, namely conceptual understanding, the nature of science, procedural knowledge, and social domain, are missing in a theme plan, it is less likely that scientific literacy will develop. So this is something important to understand. So study table 3.2 on the 7 phase inquiry-based cycle of learning, and we basically shows how focus can be done on the 4 domains, to ensure that they develop at each phase. So because of the missing elements in the assessment standards, we think that the South African curriculum does not foster a true open IBSE. So nevertheless, it gives guidelines to the kinds of learner activities teachers should develop. So you may want to read more about inquiry-based learning and the role of the teacher during inquiry activities. And this can be probably researched within the internet component, where you can download different information that can give you a broader understanding. So looking at the introduction, this the goal of this phase is basically to confront learners, with a problem connected to a real world situation, to excite their curiosity and to increase their understanding of the nature of science. So the domain focus is mainly the nature of science, but also relating it to real world situations. When we look at exploration, the goal of this phase is basically to connect real world situations to learners' prior knowledge, of the topic under investigation. So as a teacher, you can show videos about a real world situation. The learners can do reading assignment about the situation. The teacher can ask learners questions about their understanding of a situation. So the teacher can develop also a concept map. We have discussed this, where they give learners an understanding, learners an opportunity to basically show their initial understanding of the situation, and the learners can give ideas about what else they would like to know about the real world situation, perhaps on a wonder wall that we discussed previously in other units. Looking at designing an investigation, this phase basically focuses on formulating research questions, composing a research plan and constructing or collecting instruments for measurement. So remember, we're looking at the foundation phase, so everything needs to be within that level. So the teacher should also explain the criteria of a proper investigation, and learners should work in groups to design their investigations, and the group should have different investigations. That creates more interest. Exploration phase, I think I forgot to mention, the domain focus will be conceptual, and designing of investigation will be the nature of science, procedural, and social. When you're looking at the conducting the investigation, this phase actually focuses on data collection, where the teacher helps learners to make correct measurements and to take notes, maybe, within data handling. And the teacher should also engage learners in explaining and reflecting their investigative procedures. When you look at the conclusion, now when you're rounding off the lesson, learners must connect the data to their research questions and realize that the results, the observations and measurements they obtained and their opinions are different. They should be asked to explain their opinions, and thereby excluding their adding, within their reflections on their research. So when you look at the presentation and communication, after learners or groups have carried out the investigations and drawn the conclusions, they must communicate their results to others, in a clear and comprehensible way. Give them that opportunity, whether it be presentations, posters, videos, or creative drama. So the teacher's role here is basically to facilitate the learner's reflection on the results and how best to present them. So, learners can carry out self or peer assessments, and the teacher can assess the presentations too, so learners can make their own notes in the science journals, if possible within the specific foundation phase grades. But we should make sure that it doesn't remove the social element of the phase if possible. So deepening during this phase, the learners reflect on the inquiry process, which deepens their understanding of the topic. So as a teacher, we should return to the concept map and either make a new map to reflect learners' new understanding or basically make notes on the first concept map. So the class should return to the wonder wall, and reflect on which questions they wondered about, and what have been answered and which they would still inquire into. These reflections should lead to a new cycle of open IBSA. So after you have studied these phases, you should be able to see how to incorporate it within your lesson plan. And do you agree with us that the South African curriculum for science learning in the foundation phase does not lend itself to true open IBSE? That's why it needs to be intentional. Okay, so these are just questions that you can ask yourself, as I explained the content. It's basically questions you can ask yourself while going through the content, and trying to understand the 7 phase inquiry-based learning cycle. And, when you start working on a blank template, the process will feel complicated, and tedious. So theme planning is not easy in the beginning. So you will need to refer to this table as often as possible, until you understand it and be able to apply it. So for an explanation of each phase, you can read the table, and you also need to develop learner and teacher activities for each phase, so that you gain that practice required. So throughout theme planning, you will ask yourself, is this the best way to do this? As a novice teacher, you must try your best to develop and improve a theme plan year after year. So don't give up. It's a work in progress. Okay, so now we're looking at the links, between the 7 phase inquiry based learning cycle in the South African curriculum. So if you look at it, there's a figure 3.2 that gives these links where you start with the introduction, exploration within the curriculum, where learners lay out the material selected by the groups, designing and investigation. It's in the curriculum, it will be the part where learners tell who will do what in the investigation. Conducting the investigation within the curriculum, learners participate in the activity during that time. When it comes to the conclusion within the curriculum, learners basically reflect on whether it was possible to carry out the plan. And when it comes to the presentation, learners use different ways to communicate information. When we look at deepening the curriculum, learners reflect on other topics that can be investigated. This is where the curious minds wonder about other topics and other areas that that they want to learn more about. So the five threads that run through all 7 stages of the inquiry based model for open IBSE is basically the big ideas. That's why you'll see that whatever you learned in learning unit 1 and 2 need to be applied and incorporated within this theme as well. Big ideas, in example, adaptation, change, all of that. The nature of science, conceptual change, social domain, and process skills. So when you study, when you doing theme planning, you look at how the big idea of, for example, adaptation and how the 4 domains of scientific understanding, namely conceptual change, the social domain, the process skills, the nature of science, can be weaved through the theme. So you should think of these 5 aspects as threads that run through all activities, especially the teacher questions, So theme planning is a very personal experience, and no theme plan is ever completely wrong or right. So remember, especially when it comes to your assignments and your exams, you need to ensure that you bring out your own understanding and your own application within your your theme planning. Don't try to copy from the internet or use your friend's theme planning. Once the markers are marking, they notice when students have the exact same lesson plan and the theme planning is exactly the same. Because like I said, it's a personal experience. No student should have the exact same lesson plan, and things shouldn't be taken out from the internet. So you should show your creativity, and you need to bring scientific inquiry into the topics of the curriculum. So it is a good idea to maybe form small groups of teachers in the same grade, possibly from different schools, to have each group develop a theme plan. So the groups can swap theme plans around. That's within your career, and together reflect on how to improve each plan. So these kind of groups are basically called communities of practice. So you may want to do some extra reading, on inquiry-based learning. And many theme plans for science education for young learners are available online. So you need to adjust them slightly to obviously suit your context through. Okay, so let's look at the next slide where we talk about drawing concept maps. So when you look at drawing concept maps, remember at the beginning and at the end of each theme, based on science, teachers want to know what learners know about the concepts taught. And at the end, you want to know how much they have learned about the concepts. So that is, how much their ideas about concepts have changed. So learners can draw concept maps in their science journals to show how much they've learned. And drawing concept maps is a much better way of learning science, learning about scientific concepts than writing, a lot of notes from the board. It's difficult for students to go through that again. So instead of writing words, we can communicate by drawing concept maps, and concept maps can be used to explain a concept without using sentences. So, we're looking at the attention level of foundation phase students, and we're trying to ensure that it's not too much information at once, basically. We're looking at the bootstrapping activities as well. So that's very important for you to understand. So remember, young learners should also have a science journal, or a notebook with either blank pages or only, a combination of blank pages in which they can write and draw their science related ideas as they develop. So learners can actually communicate their understanding thereafter through diagrams, concept maps, creative activities, and all of that. So it's very important that you incorporate the science journal within your teaching in the classroom. Okay, and just before I get into the lesson planning part, I just want to ensure that you do understand that the cultural historical perspective of IBSE theme planning is very important, as well as the integration of language, creativity, mathematics, and technology in IBSE theme planning as well. You need to read about that in your study guide. Let's look at daily lesson planning for inquiry-based theme planning. So remember, when you're looking at daily lesson planning, this is normally the template that we expect you to use, within your assignment and your exam as well, where you're going to make sure that you complete the top of the main information in terms of the content area, the type of lesson, the topic, the subject area, the theme of the week, the big idea. In foundation phase, it's very important to plan this overall. And then you're looking at the outcomes. Basically the outcomes are giving us an indication of learners are able to do 1, 2, 3 after the lesson. And when it comes to the concepts, we're looking at new concepts planned to be taught, deciding what concepts or new knowledge are you planning to teach. When it comes to differentiation provided, in terms of the enrichment and learner support, you need to show how you're making provision for learner enrichment, and learner support, and add the concerns you have as well. When it comes to lesson presentation, the introduction to the lesson, this is where you provide a detailed description of how you plan to begin your lesson by explaining how you will greet learners, set the atmosphere for the lesson, activate the learner's prior knowledge, create a link about what they already know and the new knowledge that you will be presenting. And you also need to explain how the theme you have selected above will help you, indicate the resources you will be using, whether you start with a video or picture, whatever the case may be. Remember, now it's when you incorporate the 7-phase cycle. So phase 1 would be your introduction. When you come to the body of the lesson, remember, you can provide a detailed description of the content you will be presenting. You need to indicate how you will present the content of the lesson, and also consider what activities the learners will be required to do. And this is where you can also incorporate, the phases where exploration, designing an investigation, conducting an investigation. When you look at the consolidation, the conclusion of the lesson, you need to provide a detailed description of your plan for the conclusion of the lesson. So explain how you will consolidate the new knowledge and how you will incorporate an assessment of the objectives and wrap up the lesson. So what follow-up activities you will use is also important at this stage, to consolidate and reinforce the lesson concepts and the content taught. So this is where the phase 5 can come in, the conclusion, and things like that. You can also add the presentation deepening following this. So assessments, when it comes to the assessor, you need to provide details of how you will assess the learners at the end of the lesson to determine whether they have achieved the objectives, using these formats or any other method. So in terms of self-assessment, peer assessment, teacher assessment, when it comes to the forms, you maybe incorporate the presentation phase, where you talk about participation, written work, demonstrations, models, all of that. So participation would be answering questions, reading activities, dialogue, role play. When it comes to written work, you think of writing exercises, essays, making models, drawings, paintings. Demonstrations would be physical demonstrations, performing actions, experiments. And when it comes to models, think of collages, artwork, construction. And then when you're looking at the strategy methods, in terms of questioning, listening, writing, observation, reading, interpreting, reviewing, watching a video, listening comprehension. So this is all the strategy or methods that you could use within your lesson. Remember, it's not where you're going to use all, but you consider which ones are appropriate or relevant for that specific lesson. When you look at assessment instruments, you think of checklists that you can create, assessment scale, a rubric or holistic rubric or whatever other, you need to give details on it. When you're reflecting, remember it is necessary to reflect on the lesson you have presented by indicating, whether I noticed that students enjoyed the lesson. This is not a good reflection. You need to reflect on the strengths, the weaknesses, the challenges, and whether the objectives were met, what you noted earlier. So what would you change and what you learned from the lesson and what would you do differently next time? So this is a good reflection of a lesson. When you're talking about resources, you need to provide evidence of all the teaching resources used for the lesson. It's good to incorporate photos as well. You can also write down a list of the resources used and equipment, maybe artwork, the homemade equipment that you can add a picture of that as well. And, teaching resources that you used, maybe it would be links or maybe perhaps, photos or basically details on that. So I hope that makes sense to you. And it's very important. This is very important for daily lesson planning, for inquiry-based theme planning. So when we're looking at assessments for science learning, how does the curriculum guide teachers? So this is very important that you understand that the curriculum guides teachers on what to teach and how to teach it, and it lists what learners should know and be able to do. Be able to do. So it therefore guides the assessment that teachers carry out. So it's something that you need to go through in terms of looking at this diagram, where you need to understand, can learners communicate their understanding through various means? Can they communicate reasoning about a scientific concept? This is all part of conceptual understanding, and learners communicate their understanding of process, skills, and concepts and the nature of science, through observing. You use process skills such as observing. Can the learners use different senses to make these observations? Comparing, can learners compare the phenomena to identify differences and similarities? And are they able to classify? Can they group similar objects together? And measuring, can learners make measurements using formal or informal units, whether it be a data table as well? The nature of science, are learners developing that understanding of the 9 points? So it's very important that you go through this section very well, so that you are able to understand the assessment for science learning and able to apply it. And Thank you, students, for listening to this presentation. I just want to say that this is basically a brief summary of Learning Unit 3 and not basically touch on every aspect that is important. So please do go over everything thoroughly. There's also the cultural historical perspective that we didn't go through, and the integration of mathematics, language, creativity, and technology. That's also equally important to all the other sections that I've noted. So just remember, teachers should develop an understanding of every learner's social situation of development and how this interacts with the demands of what has to be done, in an activity, and how you facilitate learning through an activity. Because they will understand, you need to be able to understand your learners and how to interact with them within their zone of proximal development. So just remember, the cultural historical perspective of learning is quite complex, and it's something that you need to go through thoroughly, as well as the integration of different subject areas as well. So all the best going through Learning Unit 3, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this module.